Former NCAI President and Tribal Chairman Joe Garcia stated it best at the May 2nd, 2010 tribal consultation held in New Mexico. If we can initiate a partnership between the tribes, NCAI, NIEA, the White House, and the Department of Education, as well as the Bureau of Indian Education, then we've got the right group moving forward with a common goal. A part of this common goal goes back to data. Sharing of data between these agencies and our tribal communities are an essential part of telling our stories. But there is a lot that we still need to know. The who and where of our students. It is imperative that the Bureau of Indian Education and Department of Education work together to conduct a new survey and accounting of our students. Our tribes and schools are currently funded for Johnson O'Malley at a 1994 student count. The student count freeze must be lifted so that the funding for these programs are based upon a true reflection of our student populations. As an example, one of the 638 contracts for Johnson O'Malley from the state of Idaho that was funded for the 2008-2009 school year was at a student count of 3,154 students, but the actual Indian student count for that school year was 4,242. We must work with the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Justice, Offices of Civil Rights, to address the fact that our country suspends, expels, and pushes out, and eventually incarcerates our youth and citizens at a disparate rate. The United States leads all countries in the percentages of its citizens incarcerated. While our American Indian youth make up 1% of the U.S. population ages 10 to 17, they constitute between 2 to 3% of the youth arrested for such offenses as larceny, theft, and liquor violations. Unprecedented levels of collaborations are taking place now between the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Education. The Department of Ed's series of tribal leaders consultation throughout the country are not over, but are rather just the beginning of a collaborative approach at revitalizing the education systems within our communities. One of the common themes that arose during these consultations was around the topic of intergovernmental cooperation and as a valid means of exercising tribal sovereignty. These agreements do not in and of themselves compromise tribal sovereignty, but rather they serve as a means to elevate our Native educations as a joint priority. The Bureau of Indian Education, under the leadership of Director Keith Moore, is partnering with our tribal nations to create an education system that supports academic achievement, safe learning environments, student growth, tribal control, and the teaching of tribal cultures and languages. This tribal control is the essence of local control, and under the current direction of the BIE, those school systems will emerge as successful models of tribal control and excellence. But the advocacy for the successful transitions for our Native students do not begin with the K-12 system. As Native people, our advocacy begins before a life is even formed and will follow our people into their transition as wisdom keepers, our elders in our communities. A critical component in our nation-building process includes the establishment of priorities for Native higher education issues. Tribes must take an active role in promoting and addressing Native higher education issues at a community and national level. Respectively, the Bureau of Indian Education has a long-standing role in Native higher education and needs to support tribes in more effectively addressing priority areas within the tribal colleges and universities, as well as predominantly white institutions. Further, the trust responsibility of the federal government to provide for the education of our Native students must be a national priority. Addressing these issues will require collaborative efforts that include tribes, federal agencies, education institutions, national organizations, but most importantly, all of you and your communities. We must tell our stories. We have powerful stories to tell that will tell our Native youth that they can succeed beyond any barriers that are placed in their way. To fully restore the sacred trust, we need to restore the self and self-determination by capturing and sharing the self in the stories. This is incredibly important for two reasons. When we collaborate and share those stories, what works best when educating our Native children will rise to the top. And when these stories are shared, All of the people will know how incredibly successful our educational programs are and the power that they hold for the future of Native education. My story is much different than my late elder, Hinmatuya Lachit Lachai Lachai. I was blessed with the opportunity to minor in my Native education at a public four-year institution. NIEA calls upon all of you to share your story of how language and culture is cherished in your communities in a way that builds up the foundation of our nation, our communities, and your families. The momentum towards self-determination as it relates to Indian education, it began many decades ago, and NIEA was a critical component to that. NIEA was formed in 1969, as I mentioned earlier, as a very grassroots effort. As former Deputy Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Purnell Sweat stated, in the passage of the Indian Education Act of 1972, marked a milestone of change for Indian people in many ways, in the role that they were to play in their children's education, in the quality of education Indian children were to receive, in the accepted policy of telling Indian people what they could have rather than asking them what they wanted. In essence, the keynote in Indian education continues to be change, but with one significant difference. We are all now in a position to initiate that change. And the change, it has begun. This new era of Indian education policy is moving in the right direction. Please join us in putting the Native at the forefront of education and self-determination. Join us in increasing our ability to more effectively educate our children with the necessary steps to restore the sacred trust. A critical way to restore the trust in Native education is to honor that Constitution through the federal appropriations. Our Republican and Democrat legislators are concerned about tough economic times that our great nation faces. Some policymakers state that they want to return federal domestic program funding to 2008 levels, which would be between a $55 to $60 billion cut and would be catastrophic to American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian education programs. Some members of Congress would go even further, effectively defunding large governmental programs that support our children. In contrast, the White House Tribal Nations meeting last December, President Obama said that in the fiscal year 2012 budget, those most in need would be cut the least. We are also in a unique moment in history with a very large freshman congressional class in the House of Representatives, many of whom represent our homelands. We will be walking onto the Capitol Hill this week as both congressional houses are in a state of flux. The 112th Congress is settling in, committee assignments are being made as we sit here today, and members are marking out their own roles. This is the perfect time for all of us to come together to change the legislative and budget conversation to show the best and most effective practices that we use to educate our children. Our methods work. Let's tell Congress how and why we make a difference through our Native education strategies and ways that impact great nations. Despite the budget situation, Native education programs and funding cannot be cut any more than they already have been in the past. Federal funding generates dramatic economic, social, and cultural returns and fulfills the federal government's trust obligation to our communities. We can work to restore the trust by making Indian education that national priority. I was encouraged to hear President Obama place such a high emphasis on education reform in his State of the Union speech a few weeks ago. He stated that every child deserves a quality education and that higher education must be within the reach of every student. We stand firm and say that American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students must be a part of that conversation. We want to see this realized in the reauthorization of ESEA in the 112th Congress. Since 2005, the National Indian Education Association has been actively preparing for reauthorization by conducting 11 field hearings and numerous listening sessions with your communities, educators, school administrators, parents, tribal leaders, to learn about the challenges our nations faced under No Child Left Behind. NIEA has developed our proposed amendments to ESEA based upon all of the input that we received from you during those consultations and listening sessions. The ESEA bill drafted in the 110th Congress included many of NIEA's proposed amendments. including provisions that created a native language immersion and revitalization grant program in the Title VII of ESEA within the Department of Education. That's an accomplishment based on your efforts and advocacy. In his State of the Union speech, President Obama said that this act would replace No Child Left Behind with a law that is more flexible and focused on what is best for our kids. To that end, the reauthorization should respect tribal sovereignty, the self-determination of Native peoples, and the protection and instruction of Native languages. We also recommend that it include expanding Title VII to address the unique cultural and educational needs of our children, improving cooperation among tribes, state and federal agencies, and making sure that education is placed as a top priority. Improving educational opportunities for parents, families, and tribes to participate in that education process. And improving the measurement systems for adequate yearly progress that reflect our students' success. We also must demand an increase in the requiring of data collection and research evaluations specifically for our programs. This reauthorization must also respect the sovereign status of Indian tribes by elevating the authority of tribal education departments and agencies throughout various titles in ESEA that impact Indian country, Native nations, and provide the same access to federal funding and education planning resources that state education associations and local education agencies are afforded. We must also restore the voice within the U.S. Department of Education. We previously had an Assistant Secretary for Indian Education with the authority to engage in the various title programs that ESEA impacted. We must advocate for the restoration of that position. On behalf of the National Indian Board of Directors, staff, and our members, thank you to our Creator. Thank you to our past warriors, the founders of NIEA, and all of you as our members, the fabric of our organization that allows us to be strong today while we plan for many, many generations to come. Yoch kalo.